By all accounts, this place got along pretty good. We're not sure what happened in the Jim Crow era when the street, Duke of Gloucester, and all of Colonial Williamsburg was very integrated until they came in and purposefully displaced the black population because Rockefeller wanted America to see a living museum that made them happy and feel good about being free from Britain. And that somehow the African American piece didn't quite fit into that picture.
It is the late 17th century, and while there are already a handful of enslaved Africans in the area, the number of individuals transported to the so-called New World as unfree laborers has rapidly grown in recent decades. The town of Williamsburg had recently been established, yet it only contained a modest population of a few hundred. During these foundational years of the town, European colonial powers increasingly turned to Africa for the majority of their slaves. As a consequence, anti-black racism began to cement in the minds of many Anglo-Virginians, and by 1730, individuals of African descent comprised roughly half of the town's population. While the vast majority of these black historical figures were enslaved, Williamsburg had roughly 11 free black residents.
Nevertheless, these individuals were the lucky ones, as an overwhelming 88% of Williamsburg families owned enslaved Africans during the 1780s, with the vast majority of families possessing 1 to 5 enslaved people. Due to their urban location, these unwilling men, women, and children primarily conducted domestic tasks, while they largely evaded agricultural work predominantly associated with slave labor. Personal accounts suggest their living conditions were nothing less than cruel. For example, Ebenezer Hazard, a traveler to Williamsburg, complained in 1777 that all Virginians did not appropriately dress their slaves, with young men only given worn-out shirts to wear.
Due to the town's small size, most white residents knew enslaved individuals by name. The tight-knit nature of Williamsburg allowed these individuals to wield more personal agency than their more isolated, plantation-confined counterparts. Impromptu marriages between unfree persons were likely common, and there was very little that dissenting enslavers could do to destroy these unions due to the town's small population. Alternatively, though, this familiarity between the free white residents and black slaves made it difficult for the latter to undermine their white master's authority without being identified. As one historical reenactor stated in character,
"Good day to you. My name is Jimmy, with an E, Jemmy, and you are in Williamsburg. Everything is colonial here, all the way from the north to the south. And there's nearly 2,000 people in this city. With 2,000 people, 52% of those people is enslaved and free Negroes. 2% are free. And with that 52%, you can imagine as you look around this place, what it must feel like to a master, to be surrounded and outnumbered by the people you own and control. So as you walk through the city, you'll see houses, but think about, where did the bricks come from? Who put the windows in the window panes? The 52%.
the only free time afforded to these individuals was on Saturdays, which were typically characterized by socialization and dancing within the slave quarters, as well as Sundays, when they would rest and tend to their local gardens. To summarize, this period saw innumerable people stripped of their names, cultures, and social ties for the exploitation by Anglo-Americans. While the then capital of Virginia had fewer black slaves than other metropolitan areas, such as Charleston, South Carolina, this can be attributed to the small population of the city overall. Under the omnipresent watch of white elite, these black historical figures undermined the white historical political hegemony by creating strong social ties with other African-descended peoples in the community. As Williamsburg endured the American Revolution, Civil War, and numerous other hardships, agency for its black residents ebbed and flowed with the political tide of the period. Nevertheless, almost every resident of color understood the hypocrisy of the American government. Many scholars estimate that after the Revolutionary War, Williamsburg was a predominantly black town, yet their disenfranchisement and overall prejudice originating from British colonialism was reinforced with the stroke of a pen, writing, "All men are created equal."
Fast forward to the 1920s, the economic prosperity which characterized the Gilded Age and Progressive Era allowed individuals such as John D. Rockefeller to accrue previously unimaginable wealth. Following the start of the 19th century, Americans increasingly fictionalized their shared historical past through the apotheosis of the so-called Founding Fathers. This elevation to godlike status among the signers of the Constitution and Declaration of Independence both allowed white citizens to feel good about their national origins and ignore the issues that continued to plague the newly independent society. Rockefeller attempted to reignite this patriot fervor through the creation of living museums that commemorated America's collective past. While doing this, Rockefeller decided to omit what President John Adams referred to as the foul contagion in the human character. This omission not only removed black history from one of the most foremost museums in the nation, but also displaced several Williamsburg residents. Nevertheless, Williamsburg's black community endured these hardships. As in centuries prior, many turned to places of worship for solidarity. Williamsburg's historic First Baptist Church became a sanctuary for many people of color since the late 18th century, allowing them a space to air their grievances and foster a sense of solidarity. Connie M. Harshaw, president of the Let Freedom Ring Foundation and member of Williamsburg's historic First Baptist Church, describes the church's early history.
The story of the church, in spite of the fact that it was demolished and moved and replaced and taken out of the central location of Colonial Williamsburg, the more important story is how it got there. The church was organized in 1776, and it was organized on a plantation called the Green Springs Plantation. The plantation owners there allowed them to worship as early as 1776. They moved from Green Springs Plantation over to a place called Raccoon Chase. It was at the end right now of Burns Lane off Jamestown Road, because they were worshiping in secrecy, because it wasn't legal for black people more than two together. A white townsman discovered them worshiping under what they called a brush arbor. And so that was at Raccoon Chase, and what he did was he donated land for them.
After donating this land to these black Christians, a building was soon erected. This meeting spot was a crucially important space for the increasingly marginalized residents of color. Indeed, Harshaw attests that women's involvement in church life provided services and help to other parish members when facing difficult times. This collective solidarity, predominantly fostered by women, helped to educate their members and encourage financial prosperity within the black community.
We know a building was there. A building which we now know was built by the African Americans, free and enslaved. They built the building. They worshiped there for 100 years. Women they played a very, very important role. It was the center of the community. The meals were done here. We taught children to read. We did daycare here. Started different community activities like the NAACP and things like that. It was the focus of the community. And it was a really great babysitter too, because the black kids couldn't go anywhere else to play or to be social. So the churches became the hub of social activity.
This prosperity changed when Rockefeller and other Williamsburg officials attempted to gentrify the town after creating the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. Being one of the most affluent men alive, Rockefeller had the financial means and political connections to remove black folk from their homes, businesses, and even places of worship.
The building in 1957, they leveled the building on Nassau Street. because it didn't quite fit into the fabric of the story that was being told in Colonial Williamsburg. So John D. Rockefeller and Reverend Godwin came in and said, let's just tear it down. They had a parking lot over that spot until March 2020. In 1776, this town was 52% black, free and enslaved. Some of the wealthiest African Americans in the country were here. And that story is not being told. And so what Cliff Fleet, Catherine Rowe, and myself have decided to do, we partnered. Because we said this story has to be a more complete story.
The Black community rightfully took issue with the assertion that the museum was historically accurate, and subsequently called for greater and more substantial representation within Colonial Williamsburg. One investigative article found that the Black stagecoach drivers, who were some of the only Black historical actors hired before 1979 by the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, informed visitors of Black history in Williamsburg on their own volition. However, in the 1980s, the Foundation made strides to incorporate this long-omitted history into their museum. For roughly the next decade, Colonial Williamsburg continued to make reserved steps in the right historical direction, but one of its most significant controversies awaited them. The Foundation decided to show a historically accurate slave trade outside of Raleigh's Tavern. While this event likely included many parallels with actual auctions of the time, onlookers were nevertheless horrified at seeing Black Americans dressed as slaves and auctioned off. A historian for the Foundation, Dr. Kathy Hellier, described the controversy.
There's been some pretty controversial stuff done, one of which was a slave auction that it was our African American programming department in the late 90s determined that this would be something that we wanted to show people. It was heartbreaking. It was a very controversial program. The NAACP was here. There was a lot of protest. The program went forward. I think they were right to question it.
Okay.
Because, their interests are making sure that, damage isn't done to their community. And I'm not sure that they were completely aware of who was actually putting this program together, which is our African American interpreters. We had in the Raleigh in 2019, that was the 40th anniversary of our interpretation of African American history in particular, and there was an exhibit there, and we actually did play the program and a video of some of the reactions afterwards. The reactions were interesting because some of the people who had really protested it ended up saying, no, this was valuable. It wasn't an exploitative program. It was an accurate program, and it was valuable that people should see, the separation of families and people being bought and sold in the open. It's important. These are important stories. It's important information.
To conclude, Colonial Williamsburg has been working to include more representation of their full history in their programs. Educating people today about Colonial Williamsburg's history of slavery and about the lives of enslaved people is necessary and incredibly important. Colonial Williamsburg has increased their program's representation, but there is more room for representation and acknowledgement of its complete history. Historians like Dr. Kathy Hellier and actors and historical interpreters like James Ingram have shown us how Colonial Williamsburg has changed and continues to grow. Overall, education should be at the forefront of Colonial Williamsburg's goals, as it is so important for people to push for an increase in complete education and representation to ensure that Colonial Williamsburg is respectful and honest.